first responders was saving our lives. Because the more of us who know about what happened on 9/11, it's never going to happen again in this country. That there should be no one that loses a family member to a false flag event, such as what happened on September 11th. So right now, I'm bringing up a mentor of mine, superhuman, and I don't even have to say more words than that, because we all know him. We've seen what Bob's done over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob McIlvaine.
Excuse me, I got a bag of tricks here. All right, thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming out. Yeah, you just get emotional, really. I always practice not to get emotional, but it just never happens. Because it's an ongoing nightmare. But it's so important to keep that nightmare right in front of my head. I don't know who wrote it once, but you know, when you have a nightmare, 2 days, that day, you just can't stand it when you first wake up. And it just, you know, you've all had horrible nightmares. And you wake up and you can't believe you're there, or you're still in the nightmare. Well, I make an attempt to live in that nightmare, because if the nightmare goes away, I get complacent. And that's important to me, is not to be complacent, because I owe it to my son to find out what happened. I really do. But it makes it very difficult, because it keeps that emotion constantly alive. It doesn't take much for me to, get upset. But again, I didn't want to talk about that, but I just, everywhere I go, I try to prepare myself. I say, just stay cool. But as soon as I get up at the mic, I think of Bobby, and he's dead. He was murdered. So sometimes I worry. Like in war. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people here who remember the 60s. Life magazine. What did Life magazine do about the Vietnam War? Every single week, they put pictures of children, soldiers. The war was not sanitized. Well, the government really learned a lesson. Everything's become sort of sanitized. The theorizing about 9/11 becomes theorized. We're losing a face. Here's a face. That's a face that was 26 years old. And he was murdered. And I'm running off course. I didn't get a chance. Well, I'll just do what I can. But Bobby Bobby's for people who have never heard me speak, Bobby was a Princeton graduate. Graduated in 93, or graduated in 97 from Princeton, graduated in 93 from Albert Dublin High School, so real close to here. Went to Princeton, graduated, and got a job immediately up in New York City. He was in publishing. But one of his main, in fact, his only client in his last job was Merrill Lynch. So he got out of publishing and he started with Mercy Marcel. Well, anyway, that day, 2000, September 11th, 2000, I worked at Merrill Lynch, which was across the street. Lived at 66 between 1st and 2nd. He just loved New York. We used to come up for lunch on weekends. He was so proud of himself how he could hail a taxi. And he knew the subway system back and forth. God knows how many times I've been up to, I was up in New York City twice this week. I had to go to different places in Brooklyn. Subway system is the most difficult thing. I get panic attacks. I'm afraid I can't put my Visa card in the thing because there's people behind you, they start screaming at you. It's a tough job, but he was always so proud of himself that he had that subway system. So he just loved New York. And I love it too because it's the greatest place in the world. But on that morning, he said 66 between 1st and 2nd, went up and got the subway. Takes it down, I think he gets off at, I'm forgetting the street names already. But anyway, he was supposed to be in Merrill Lynch at 9 o'clock. So he walks down, and this is the scenario. Now remember, I'm a parent. I certainly will proudly say I'm part of the 9/11 truth movement. But I am doing it for one purpose and one purpose only. I have an obligation to my son to find out what happened to him. I know what happened to him. He was brutally murdered, but at that time I certainly didn't know it. But much of my investigation is on what happened to Bobby. Again, if you've ever lost a child, you want to know, did he suffer? Did she suffer for 2 seconds, for a nanosecond, or for half a second, for 10 seconds, whatever? And that's my obligation. But damn, you always want to know that. My wife will never talk about that, but I know it's in her mind. So after 9/11, we immediately went up to New York. And like everyone else, just roaming around, but there weren't any bodies around. But we still had hope because people at Merrill Lynch said, well, he was supposed to be at Merrill Lynch. But my thing when I went up to New York, I just sort of knew he was dead. Because there had to be at least, just from us, phone calls. And his cell phone was receiving the calls. So then we thought, well, maybe he's in a hospital somewhere, unconscious. So we went up there, we just looked all over. We had like 15 people. I remember being with the Cantor Fitzgerald people. And we were just moving in mass throughout New York City. This is on Wednesday, September 12th. My son was extremely optimistic. I know we'll find him. But I just, because he's not answering the phone, but of course there was some hope. And on Thursday, we're up at his best friend's apartments up at 77th Street. And his father worked at the prison. Getting free at the prison. What's the prison? Rikers Island, up in New York City. We had detectives out trying to find out what happened. Well, we're up there around 2 o'clock, maybe 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, because we were out all morning. And we get a call from one of the detectives. He said he was found. The elation, unbelievable. But then we got the message. He was dead on arrival. So when they tell us where to go, we go down to, they had down at Canal Street. They had not a triage center, but a command post. So we went down, all 15 of us went down there. And they let us in immediately. And they took us in a big room. Now, I don't talk about Rudy Giuliani because, I'll mention this in a second, because I think he's part of the criminal act, because the fact that the evidence, I love watching CSI all the time. I always try to relate to 9/11. And I said, Jesus Christ, there's nothing was investigated about that day. When you learn later that all this is a piece from the towers, and I'll just mention that in a second. But anyway, we go into a room and they provided psychologists,